So, welcome to the Trilogy. I think I made a big claim on my postcard, what every practitioner needs to know. Who am I to say that? Well, that's a statement of opinion as well as a piece of marketing. But I think that that's true because the three things that we're going to talk about here, the first segment, which is, well, what did I say? Recognize what students need and discover how to engage their curiosity. That's what the first segment is about, right? Which is, how do you do an evaluation? How do you figure out what to do with someone? And how do you make that a part of the learning process? People call me up and they say, can you help me? And so I can't tell you over the phone. Let's, come in, we'll do an evaluation. And we'll see if, Feldenkrais is something for you. Well, how long will it take? I don't know. They're going to learn something. Well, how long will it take me to learn something? 10 minutes? 15 minutes? I think the person has to learn something before they lie down. Certainly at the first lesson. For a number of reasons. They have to learn something because you've got to make it clear before the end of the lesson that they're going to learn something. You certainly have to make it clear before the third lesson. Because if you just make people feel good the first few times, it's kind of like an ambush if you change the rule in the third lesson and say, okay, time for you to learn. I think it's important for somebody to learn something so your role is clear. It's important for them to learn something at the beginning so they begin to trust that you have something to offer them. So we're going to talk about whatever you want to call that thing in the beginning. There's no politically correct phrase for that. Right? Assessment, evaluation, they're all kind of loaded one way or another. So whatever you want to call it, you can call it what you want. I think if you give lessons and at the end of the lesson, somebody gets up and they're like, well, that's very subtle. They're just being polite. They don't know what happened, right? And I'm not saying that everyone needs to know at the end of the lesson what happened and be able to tell you, but I think that if at the end of the lesson, immediately at the end, a few hours later, the next day, someone hasn't learned something, if they can't tell you what they've learned, then I think you've kind of missed the boat with the lesson and you missed it at the beginning. So that's why the beginning is so important, and that's what we're going to talk about. The second segment, cultivate hands-on sensitivity, skill, and strategy. So in the second segment, we're going to go through the whole FI repertoire, starting with the basics. Yeah? Just in case you missed something in the beginning, but also because everything that comes afterwards is based on a few fundamental skills. So we're going to talk about what those are. Making skeletal contact, having directional touch, etc. And then in the third segment, we're going to learn what makes a lesson and how to turn that knowledge into persuasive, lasting learning. So in the last segment, we're going to talk about the composition of lessons. First of all, so that you can take the lessons you know and unpack them and understand how and why they're working. We're going to focus on FI, but FI and ATM follow the same kind of compositional rules, so we can talk about either one. In this mentor training that I was talking about a little while ago, I've had 4 mentoring groups. And with all the groups, I've asked people to apply. Why do you want to do this? For people with 5 or more years experience to learn how to help newer practitioners become better practitioners. And because I think being a mentor or a coach or a tutor is different than being a good practitioner. It's learning the skills to do that. So when I ask people why they want to do that, they talk about what they want to do for the community, but they also talk about their own practice and what they want to learn. And what was amazing is almost everyone, 3/4 of the people, said something like this: I give lessons and they don't work, and I don't know why. And I give lessons and they do work, and I don't know why. Right? And so I don't think you have to necessarily be thinking about why while you're doing it, but I think you have to develop a kind of aesthetic, a kind of intuition of what holds lessons together, right? Of how to begin lessons and what your choices are, about how to touch someone so that actually touching and all the touching skills are second nature. You don't have to think about where do I put my hands. So I do think figuring out what to do at the beginning knowing the repertoire of FI skills, understanding how lessons are put together. I do think that every practitioner needs to know that. Okay? Now, people have different ways of teaching lessons, just like people have different ways of cooking. If you've never worked with me before, you'll find out, I warn you now, that my metaphors rarely leave the kitchen. And then they end up on the bridge of some Star Trek episode. But anyways, you know, it's like cooking. Some people love to follow recipes, and they can't cook, even though they've been cooking for years, unless they go by the recipe. And some people can't follow recipes, and they have to make things up. And so, you know, when we get to composition, we're going to look at both of those strategies. I think you're better off being able to do both. Yeah? And so we'll talk about that. So my desire in teaching this course is, well, actually, you know, I think about one of my professions, BF, before Feldenkrais, was I was a professional magician. And I spent a good part of my life mystifying people. And you know, the great thing about having done that as a magician is I have no desire to do that as a Feldenkrais teacher or as a Feldenkrais trainer. So in some ways, I'm taking this course as an opportunity to demystify the work, to make it something where we're going to take the processes that happen internally and make them public, so that we'll be thinking out loud or thinking aloud. That's a little pun. I really like that pun, because thinking is allowed in this course. This is about how to think like a practitioner. The goal of a Feldenkrais training is not to teach you a bunch of formulas that you're going to follow, or the stories that Moshe told so you can tell them. The goal of Feldenkrais training, I think, is to bring you to the place so you can respond to a situation in a Feldenkraisian manner. What does that mean? Well, that's what I'm going to try to make really clear. Now, I think a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are things you already know. So it may be that many of the things that we're going to talk about you will recognize. I hope you do. Part of what I'm going to propose is a structure, a way to think about those. I've been thinking for a really long time, if we were going to codify lessons, right, and talk about, you know, what are all the different ways you could sort through lessons, like if we had a database of lessons, you know. And so lately I've taken that project really much more seriously, and I really started to talk to different people about how they think about lessons. And it's such an example of everyone having a hold of a different piece of the elephant, right? And you know, so you know, it's like it'd be like music, as if you didn't have music theory. Some people would think if you understand the rhythm, you've got the whole thing. And some people would say if you understand the melody, and other people would say instrumentation, and you know, it's like everybody has a different piece. So I want to make something that's comprehensive. In making something that's comprehensive, it'll help you recognize what you're good at, and it'll help you recognize what you're missing. In this first segment, you're going to learn a model that I developed years ago, and actually starting to teach workshops to physical therapists, wanting to have some ways for them to understand how we as Feldenkrais teachers or somatic practitioners observe movement. You're going to learn a model of how to observe people, how to think about the instructions we give, how to think about the experiences that people have. So you're going to learn a model about movement. And what happens when people learn this model is, you know, as we're going through it, get to this point, they go, oh shit, I don't know that. Right? Well, that's a good moment, right? When you recognize what you don't know. But one of the assignments I'm going to give you collectively, that I'm going to ask you to participate in, is to figure out what it is you already do know. So when you go through this list of these different categories, ways of observing yourself and other people, what's invisible for most of us is what we're already doing and what we're already good at. And it's really important that you know that, because you can build on that. A lot of people, when they're learning something new, they try to get rid of the stuff they know and concentrate on the stuff they don't know. And then you don't have any foundation. What I'm going to ask you to do, and it's actually challenging because it's so unconscious for us, is to begin to recognize the ways that you can't help but observe. Because then we can build bridges from that to other ways of observing. So then when you're not connecting with someone, you can go, maybe I'm trying to connect with them the way that I notice but I'm missing the way that they notice. In this segment in particular, and in the third segment, there's a lot of content. There are a lot of ideas that I'm going to ask you to play with and work with. You know, I always tell people at the beginning of every training that, you know, for every hour of class time, you should plan to spend at least 2 hours outside of class. Because I think that's the minimum ratio it takes to learn something. You know, what happens in an FI, what happens in an ATM, what happens here today isn't learning. It's the beginning of learning. It's the preparation for learning. Going out and using what you've learned, that's learning. You know, I mean, in the method, I think we have a little confusion between change and learning. You know, in an ATM lesson, you might change, but it doesn't mean you learned anything. Right? Because if you can't make it yours, if you can't take it with you, if you can't reproduce that behavior, whatever that means, if you can't notice those things again later and act in a different way later, have you learned something? No. You change for a little while, you learn that it's possible to change. That's certainly important. That's not learning. So here, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to encourage you, I'm going to annoy you, I might plead with you, I promise I won't harangue or embarrass you, to work with this material in between the segments. There's no way you're going to learn what I have to offer in the next few days. Well, I don't know. I can't say that. Maybe you're a bloody genius and you will learn it all, or maybe you know it all already. But I've been working with this material, well, for 20 years, I think, because before I started teaching it, I was using it. And I'm still learning from it, right? So whenever you learn something, you run into all your experiences of all of your learning from before now. You know, and those are not just intellectual experiences, they're emotional ones as well. So, you know, I'm going to give you homework that brings up emotions for some people. I'm going to ask you to think about things in a really rigorous way, and that can be challenging. In the course, I'm going to give some talks, tell you some stories, and we'll do ATM, and we'll do a lot of small group exercises, which I like to call collaboratories, because they're collaborative learning environments or laboratories, whatever. And so I think that those are a really great way to learn, and in fact, the homework assignments are suggestions for other ways that you can learn with and from your colleagues. So those will be, I think those are a really important part of the process, right? You'll get to try these ideas out and work with them. What you're going to learn in this segment also is kind of a all-purpose evaluation process. So something that I would do with almost everyone that I see at the beginning of working with them. In the next segment, we'll do another thing that you would do at the beginning of a lesson for observing people. So there's really specific skills that we're going to build up here, and there's concepts I'm going to ask you to learn to use. For the most part, when I'm giving a lesson, I'm in the happening of the moment. And you know, I may have flickers of ideas and stuff, but I'm really in the process of it. So you could say that learning all of these techniques, learning all of these ways of observing and talking, just like learning all of the different FI techniques, you learn that so it disappears. You learn technique, so you don't have to think about where to put your fingers. So you can think about why you're putting your fingers there, what experience you want the student to have, how you're using yourself. Right? You learn all these other techniques so that they become second nature, so that they become intuitive. So I just want to make sure, I didn't used to say that, and I think it's really important for me to say that. Otherwise people think that I'm trying to teach an intellectual or mechanical approach to the method. And it's anything but that. I'm shooting for rigor and clarity. I did say I want to demystify the process. That doesn't mean I can take the magic away. I mean, it is still magical that people learn. it is still amazing that if somebody can all of a sudden feel their foot can move in a way that they never felt it move before, the tone of their leg and their back changes, and how they walk changes, and how they feel about life changes in that moment. That's, if you'll pardon the vernacular, fucking amazing. It's just incredible. So that, I'm not trying to demystify that. I don't know how that works. And I don't think any neurologist is going to be able to explain that to us. And we certainly don't have to explain it to them. That's their job, right? But I think if we can be clear about the process, then something really different happens. I think Moshe was incredibly intentional. That he had a plan and a way of executing it. And he was willing to negotiate and listen to his intuition as well. I don't think you have to choose between intellect and intuition. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of the class, and I guess a little bit about my philosophy of learning.